Thank you very much, Trudy. When she says I'm special, I hope she doesn't mean like special ed. What we're going to want to do tonight, I wanted to talk about the Declaration of Independence that got our nation started. And this one's a little different than normal. I usually like to welcome questions and so on during my presentations. But what we want to do tonight is actually film this so that we can have it on the C4L website. All right, so the questions would be a bit too much of an interruption then. All right? So what I wanted to start this thing out with was a quiz. Just one question. And the question is how much you know about one aspect of the Declaration of Independence. Was the Declaration of Independence written, executed, before our revolution, or during our revolution, or after we'd won the revolution? Now, so the question's going to be, number one, how many of you think it was written before we started the revolution? How many of you think that? Okay. Now, how many of you think it was during the revolution? Okay. And how many of you think it was after the revolution? All right. The middle group is right. All right. And so what we want to do is we want to start talking about how this thing got rolling. All right. Why are we here? Why are a bunch of mostly Europeans in the middle of this continent called America? What started that? When the Muslims took Constantinople in 1453, they cut off the Silk Road, which had been a thin but important trail of commerce between Europe and China. All right, so when Constantinople, which was the European terminus of that road, was cut off from Europe, Europeans were starting to think, well, we got to find some other way to get to China. So now you know what I'm talking about, right? Columbus sailed to find something else, and this was an accident. And we have all come here as a result of that. Now, when the people from Europe started settling the eastern coast, I'm not going to talk about the Spaniards. They were really mean, okay? They had about a 100-year head start, but they didn't do it in North America. When the Europeans from primarily England started settling in North America, the French also a little bit further north, there was something unique that happened. You know, we've all spent a lot of time griping about politics, right? Well, that's not new. People griped about how they were treated back in the Middle Ages and during the Renaissance and during the period right after America was discovered. But there was two different classes of people in respect to that. One class of people said, I'm going to do something about it. And they got on ships and they came over here and they found this basically uninhabited land. There were tribes, but most of it was uninhabited. The remainder stayed at home and continued to gripe. The difference was that from that population, the people who were intolerant of being subdued are the ones who separated themselves from the rest of the population and came over here and started a new world. And when they did that, a lot of them died. So you have this two-phased sorting that made the population that created America different from the population in the whole rest of the world. One was an intolerance that they were willing to do something about, and second was the skill and the luck that made them survive this terribly risky thing. So the personality of this culture that was built on the eastern coast of North America was independent and tough and intolerant of being told what to do. Now, when they got here, they knew they had to get organized because there was diseases, there was food to be produced, there was Spaniards that would occasionally raid the coast, and the Indians. Sometimes they were friends and sometimes they weren't, and a lot of them died from that. So they became organized. They created their own each little settlement became a colony, and the colony established a self-governing process. In Virginia, it was called the House of Burgesses, and up in New England, they had a different form. But they all were Christian, and they all were speaking the same language, and these 13 different groups gradually grew. And during the 1600s, the first century of this happening, England didn't pay much attention to them. England had had a revolution where they overthrew and killed the king, and then they had to overthrow that group, and they had the plague, and they had the fire of London, and they had the Spaniards hassling them. And so the people in the New World were learning to live basically on their own, with their own decisions, their own governing, their own militia to protect them. And then in the 1700s, as the population grew and the economy became productive, the French and the English had a war in Europe, and in this continent it was called the French and Indian War. And the British won that in 1763, and then they started saying, we need to spend more attention on this America stuff. This is a pretty big area. It's now ours because we've beat the French. We're going to start protecting these people. We got to protect the Indians against them too. There was a little bit of that going on. And we're going to tax them. And we're going to regulate their trade. And this didn't work well with a bunch of people who'd grown up creating their own world. So from the 1760s into the 1770s, there was a lot of turmoil. And there was smuggling because they didn't like the British regulations. And then with the taxation, they had to come in the 1765. You've heard of the stamp tax, maybe? Now imagine every document that you produce, whether it's a contract or a deck of cards or a newspaper, had to have a stamp on it. Now, in the days before computers, how was that administered? Swarms of agents. You'll hear that term a little bit later. So, these governments in each community would set up their own laws and enforce them, and the British came in and started interfering with those processes. And some of the most famous events happened in Boston. You've heard of the Boston Massacre, where the troops that were in there enforcing the laws and marching around had become basically a standing army. Now, a standing army is a military force that answers to the king and not to the people, and it is not designed to defend you against foreign intruders. It's designed to control the population. That's a standing army. And it was something that these colonists had said, we don't need. We got a militia, and we're fairly good. So when the troops are marching around in Boston and people are hassling them and things get out of control, all of a sudden there was a bunch of shooting and 5 guys were killed. All right? Well, there was other things that went on. And when the colonists grew defiant and said, we are going to make our own communities, we're going to make our own laws, we don't want you fiddling around and telling us what to do. By 1774, it had become quite hostile. The Boston Tea Party in 1773, at the end, threw a bunch of tea in the harbor because the regulations were messing up with the commercial arrangements that the business people in Boston had already made with the rest of the world to get their tea and other things too. And when the tea got thrown in the harbor, the guy who was in charge of the troops in Boston, General Gage, told London, the Parliament, that we need laws that are going to punish these people. So the laws came down, and there was a bunch of acts called the Intolerable Acts. They shut down Boston. no trade until you pay for the tea, until you turn in the people who threw it in the harbor, and so on and so forth. And other punitive acts. And some of the punitive acts, because like in Virginia, the House of Burgesses passed a resolution supporting the people of Boston against the intolerable acts. Well, London had appointed its own governor in Virginia to replace the governor the colonists had elected. How's that going to work? Well, when Burgesses did that thing, this governor said, okay, you guys are dissolved. There's no longer a House of Burgesses. And these men started meeting in a tavern. And the turmoil and the resistance grew and grew. People started doing things more and more hostile. They burned some of the officers in effigy, and they did things like that were more and more overtly disobedient and harshly so. So in 1774, on September 1st, General Gage decided we're going to have to subdue this stuff. I mean, he'd been doing it longer than that, but he said we're going to have to subdue this stuff. And he sent troops out to a place called Somerville, Massachusetts, where there had been an armory. And early in the morning one day, the ships had gone, his barges had gone up the Mystic River, and they confiscated the citizens' arms. Gun control. Okay? And when that happened, a bunch of people got really upset about it and said, they caught us by surprise. We're going to have to pay more attention to what's going on in Boston with General Gage and so on. And so there was people like a guy named Paul Revere who helped set up an alarm network. And they went through the winter of 1775 and came out. Well, they went through the winter of 1774, and then in 1775, on April 19th, when General Gage sent out troops to go get some guns in Concord, the Paul Revere Network gave warning, and that was the day of the shot heard round the world, right? And what was going on down in Virginia at the time, they were talking about these things. And Patrick Henry in the Virginia Assembly was talking to his peers in the displaced House of Burgesses. And people were arguing, what are we going to do to get things straight with our own government? How are we going to resolve this? And some of them were talking about different ways to compromise or not. So Patrick Henry stood up to address the Virginia Assembly, and this is a condensed version of what he said. All the words are there. I just cut out a bunch of places. Patrick Henry addressed the group. He said, I wish to know what there has been in the conduct of the British ministry with those warlike preparations which cover our waters and darken our land. Let us not deceive ourselves, sir. These are the implements of war and subjugation, the last argument to which kings resort. I ask, gentlemen, what means this martial array, if its purpose be not to force us to submission? They are meant for us. They can be meant for no other. We have done everything that could be done to avert the storm which is now coming on. We have petitioned, we have remonstrated, we have prostrated ourselves before the throne. We have been spurned with contempt from the foot of that throne. In vain after these things may we indulge the fond hope of peace and reconciliation. There is no longer any room for hope. If we wish to be free, if we mean not basely to abandon the noble struggle, we must fight. I repeat it, sir, we must fight. An appeal to arms and the God of hosts is all that is left us. They tell us, sir, that we are weak, unable to cope with so formidable an adversary. But when shall we be stronger? Will it be the next week or the next year? will it be when we are totally disarmed and when a British guard shall be stationed in every house? There is no retreat but in submission and slavery. Our chains are forged. Their clanking may be heard on the plains of Boston. The war is inevitable. And let it come. I repeat it, sir, let it come. Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace. But there is no peace. The war has actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that gentlemen ask? What would they have? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take. But as for me, give me liberty or give me death. And the house cheered. And they made their resolution to support what was going on in the North. So, during that first year, after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, this fire spread across the colonies. But they wanted to just be good British subjects, treated fairly by the people in London, by Parliament. And so during that first summer, 1775, they sent out the Olive Branch Petition, asking for some sort of resolution where we could peacefully return to peace and, happy relations with the government that we felt still loyal to in Parliament. But instead of responding favorably, the king wrote the Proclamation of Rebellion. And that was basically an announcement that we are at war with you and we will subdue you. And so the colonists are standing out there and sitting and thinking, what are we going to do? We don't want this. Well, as the winter of 1775 came and things quieted down a little bit, a guy named Thomas Paine wrote a little booklet called Common Sense. And it kind of gelled what everybody was thinking and put it into terms they could understand better. In Common Sense, he said, the government has forsaken us. But we are still people. And we need to have a government that treats us as the people that it's going to protect. Now, they say that we can't fight this monstrous army and navy. But their ships are made out of oak, and we have more trees than they ever dreamed of. And we have to set a goal for this conflict that's going on right now. And that goal has to be independence. We must resolve together to do this thing that will make us free from the burdens we've been suffering. This went across the colonies. Today we would call it going viral. All right? And it gelled the thinking of the people in a variety of colonies, and this burbling sense of dissatisfaction and we've got to do something started popping up with actual resolutions. In April of 1776, North Carolina, the Halifax Resolves said, we're going to send this to the Second Continental Congress, this ad hoc group that had come out of the House of Burgesses, saying we need to go ahead and become separate. In May, it was Rhode Island. They renounced King George. In June, Virginia and Delaware, they committed to separation. That's June, okay? Then Congress sets a goal. We're going to go ahead and separate from England. Now, the first thing that this group did, it wasn't just starting to throw a bunch of rocks in the street and go crazy. They said, we have to define what our objective is, and what are principles that stand under it, so that our brethren in England will understand why we are leaving them. So they appointed a team to put together a declaration. And that declaration, or that team, sat down. Thomas Jefferson was leading it, or at least he was appointed to do the writing. And they figured, what kind of approach should we have in doing this thing? Why is a declaration necessary in the first place? Well, what we want to do is to show that we have respect for our former friends and for the world at large. All right? We want to show that our action is taken out of principle and not anger or hatred. All right? We want to show that we have a clear and limited objective. Simply leave us alone from here on out, and we'll fight for that. Because they also wanted to show that their commitment was irreversible. Now, I've given you out the little booklets that have the Constitution in it, and if you'd go to page 35, what we'll do is we'll go through. If you don't have the booklets, my wife has a couple of them on the table there, and there you go. All right, now, so when we're talking about the beginning of this declaration, what I just said was showing respect. So there on page 35, we look at when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinion of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. So this act, so fundamental to replacing an existing government, they said, this thing requires a foundation in basic values. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the source of government authority. This generation had studied the Great Awakening's discussions and philosophies and exchange of ideas. So even in the century before, this turmoil had begun. A guy named Algernon Sidney wrote, and he was in his book, he denied the rule that the rule of kings was deemed by God. Instead, he said that government should be limited with voluntary consent of the people and the right of citizens to alter or abolish a corrupt government. All right? So his discourses on government had been called the textbook of the American Revolution. He wrote this book in manuscript. It was not yet published. People who knew about it presented it to the king. It was deemed treason. Now, even in England in those days, they wanted to stick to some form of legal authentic authority and of legitimacy. That's the word I was looking for. In order to convict somebody for treason, it required 2 witnesses. But nobody had seen Algernon Sidney's writing except one person. But he got the manuscript, and that became the second witness. And they executed him in 1683. All right. He said in there, one of the most important things in his book, a people must surely perish who tamely suffer themselves to be oppressed. Now, we've all heard probably of John Locke, and he had the same sort of thing going on in the Second Treatise of Government. So what Jefferson wrote when he was working on the Declaration of Independence is that the authority of government must respond to the concept they have of what man is. So what had the concept of man become in the Great Awakening? this concept that our founders based everything on. And again, in the Declaration from Jefferson, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Remember, this is a philosophical concept, not necessarily yet a law of nature. All the previous history of mankind, men had been either masters or servants. Now they're talking about we're all equal. This is remarkable. So he said that men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, that's interesting. But then what would the nature of government be? Well, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The people that are going to be governed are the ones who have to consent to the government existing. Okay? So, to govern is to have power over the actions of people. This is a new view of what justifies that power in a society where men are seen as their own masters. They must consent to the use of such power as they delegate to their government. So, the next question this declaration needs to answer is, what course is necessary if government fails in its purpose? So he writes that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. But there's a caution in here, isn't there? Such a drastic choice. You don't want to take this thing lightly, just do it every couple of weeks, do we? It says, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Well, those are nice principles, but is this the time when we really want to be doing that? They had to consider that. And so Jefferson wrote, such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. So we go then into the next section of the Declaration, which enumerates the evidence that proved the government of King George had failed to govern with the consent and to the advantage of the people of the American colonies. Then they are struggling to protect their safety, values, and liberty. So to assess whether it's time, the Declaration of Independence then goes into a list of grievances. It begins, the history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. So next we have this list of royal actions that deprived the colonists of the power to make and administer their own laws. He says, he has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation until his assent shall be obtained, and when so suspended, he is utterly neglected to attend to them. See, the king's approval was necessary for all the laws from Parliament to come out, and before it could become law. So these decisions, these laws were being made far away to apply to the local colonies. They weren't doing any good, and when they were made, they weren't being approved by the king. He was ignoring them. So he has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people unless these people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, Parliament, a right inestimable. Now, inestimable means so important you can't put an estimate of value on it. All right? Inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. Formidable being dangerous. This power of the people is only dangerous to tyrants. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses. Remember I said about the House of Burgesses? Okay, that's one of them. Repeatedly, for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. Okay. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause other legislatures that would control the colonies, to be elected, whereby the legislative power, incapable of annihilation, has returned to the people at large for their exercise. You can't abandon the idea that laws have to be made. That's how you keep a society organized and peaceful. They weren't letting this happen in the colonies. The state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. So, what do we do? Well, he has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. One of the things that the king had done was that the proclamation line of 1763 forbid the colonists from expanding beyond the Appalachians into the lands that they had been settling recently since the French and Indian War. There was some logic to that, but it was done in a dictatorial way. So, he has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices. Now, that was barriers to self-governing by the colony. Now the list of grievances turns to actions of governing that actually harmed the colonists. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. Remember when I mentioned the stamp tax? Okay? He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies. He is affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. Remember, General Gage is now the governor in Massachusetts with his military force. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution, the English Constitution, and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial, which is what they didn't like about the Boston Massacre, from punishing for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefit of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses. In the Intolerable Acts, one of the ones made it necessary that if you're going to prosecute a British officer, You had to do it in London. Bring your court to London, basically, and your evidence and your witnesses. This is what part of the Administration of Justice Act did in that series. Then, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, Canada, establishing therein an arbitrary government and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves, Parliament, invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection. That was the proclamation of rebellion. And waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against our country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves into their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us. The Tories, the British loyalists, were fighting against the British the Patriots. They attacked, they spied on them, and so on. And he has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. Now, that's the list of complaints, and it's pretty severe. So, well, how are we going to answer the question about whether this is the time or not? The conclusion is based on the listed evidence. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Now remember, they've been trying to reach a peaceful solution, right? Nor have we been wanting in attention to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we've conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and our correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and consanguinity, common blood. So now, based on this proof that's been offered, the colonies are going to agree upon and declare their objective. And they know the objective will only be achieved by force. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We, therefore, appealing to the supreme judge of the world, for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have the full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all the other things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Now, the delegates representing their constituent citizens in each colony, now becoming a state, an independent nation emerges from this. Now the question is, they've all signed their names down at the bottom, starting with John Hancock, right? Do you think that they thought, oh, this is all hunky-dory and everybody's going to be safe? What do you think might have been some precedent that would tell them whether this was safe or risky? I have something here. All right. Now, 30 years before this, a bunch of people in Scotland figured that the British army was distracted somewhat with fighting in France and thought that they could come down from the north and overthrow the crown and install in England the king that they thought should be the real king. And so these Scots people came down in 1746, and they failed. All right? And we can take a look at this later, but this is a picture of Lord Kilmarnock, who was one of the leaders of this rebellion, being beheaded at the Tower of London. 30 years later, our founders knew about this, and they took the risk anyway. Would you have? Well, okay, so they've signed this thing, and they've made this remarkable declaration, but so what? What do you think happened? I have a book here that I'll show you at the end. This book was printed the year after the Declaration of Independence, and it includes some comments that were made by the British in reporting this event to their citizens by the British press. One book, the one that I have here, wrote, "The fatal day at length arrived, which, however the final consequences may be," remember, this was printed before the revolution was over. All right? "However the final consequences may be, must be deeply regretted by every true friend to this empire. When 13 English colonies in America declared themselves free and independent states, abjured all allegiance to the British crown, and renounced all political connection with this country, such are the unhappy consequences of civil contention. Such the effects that may proceed from too great a jealousy of power on one side, or an ill-timed doubt of obedience on the other. The Declaration has been seen by everybody. It contains a long catalog of grievances, not with fewer invectives, and it's not more temperate in style or composition than it is in act." That's how the British were seeing it. There's also a report, same book, about how it was received when the soldiers were told about it in the Continental Army. The Declaration of Independence issued by the Continental Congress was read at the head of each brigade of the Continental Army, posted at and near New York, and everywhere received with loud huzzahs, etc. And the same evening, the equestrian statue of His Majesty, which had been erected in the year 1770, was laid prostrate on the ground, and the lead of it destined to serve as bullets. The same declaration was read pretty much about the same time in almost every other town of the United Colonies, and everywhere received with equal demonstrations of joy. So, they're in the middle of this revolution, and everybody's saying, hey, we're going to become independent. It took several more years of fighting and a bit of help from the French before the British got caught at Yorktown, and they basically gave up the fight. Now, it took until, that was in 1781, it took until 1783 to get to the Treaty of Paris, where Britain, France, and Spain signed a treaty with these colonies, I guess states, right? So you guys are independent. We recognize you as a separate entity. That's what it took. So, how is it going to be governed? You know, that's just saying, okay, now you don't have that government. What are you going to do to make one? You all know that the Articles of Confederation bungled it. So they had to try back in 1787 again with a new plan. And that's called the Constitution of the United States right now. But there was misgivings about some of this stuff. When they were arguing to support the adoption, the ratification of the Constitution, Alexander Hamilton wrote in the Federalist Papers, "It seems to have been reserved to the people of this country, by their conduct and example, to decide the important question, whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend on their political constitutions on accident and force. If there be any truth in the remark, the crisis at which that decision is to be made, the crisis at which we are arrived, may with propriety be regarded as the era in which that decision is to be made, and a wrong election of the part we shall act may, in this view, deserve to be considered as the general misfortune of mankind." And I submit that question is still being asked of you. Now, the way I like to end this, I pledge allegiance, and I invite all of you to do so with me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much.